Blaine Fowler is a very fashionable man. He is also pretty good at his job. His jobs. He's a very busy guy, and he is so kindly taking time once again out of his week to join us in Studio B. The dual threat analyst is back. All right, Blaine, we're going to ask you the Twitter question first. If there's like a power play, a trump card that BYU is like, okay, you bang, invite us to the Big 12, what is it?
It really is just about financials. And nobody that they're looking at, considering, have already considered, analyzed, can have a positive financial impact on the Big 12 like BYU can. And I think that's the most important thing, because the member institutions are going, oh, do we really want to expand? If there's no financial benefit to us, then why do it? Now, there's a built-in financial benefit no matter who they add based on the current television contract. But in addition to that, is there anybody out there that gives us a boost that can bring revenue in because of viewership, ticket sales? There's little things that nobody thinks about with BYU. BYU in football and basketball, if you were to look at average home attendance right now, BYU would be number 3 in the Big 12 in football attendance, and they'd be number 2 in the Big 12 in basketball attendance. That's right, more than UConn, more than Cincinnati, who are not in the Big 12, but they'd be right there in terms of attendance. It's not just that, though. Anybody BYU plays on the road increases attendance for that game. It's because they have a national following, they affect away attendance as well.
So the strength of the religion and the brand, which includes Sunday play. So it's like, okay, you can, if Sunday play is that big a deal, which I don't think it is, maybe others do, it could be. That is actually the strength of the brand, is the religion.
Yes, and
you'll benefit.
You want teams that come into your conference that you can compete with. You don't want to bring doormats in, because this conference is looking for legitimacy. They want to stand up to Big Ten, whatever that. What is it? It's the Big. I don't know.
Big 14.
The Big 14. They call it the Big 10. That's weird.
Could be the Big 14 and the Big 12.
But the Big 10, the SEC, the ACC, they want to stand up and look competitively like they're as good from a competitive standpoint on the field and on the court. You want to add teams that when you play them in conference, help your strength of schedule and don't hurt your strength of schedule. So the criteria that they laid out in the press conference the other day, those are all obvious. BYU's number 1 in every single solitary one of those criteria. You guys have already covered that. But then there's all these little things behind the scenes, like away attendance, strength of schedule, all of these things that play into BYU's favor as well. It's overwhelmingly in BYU's favor that they get in the Big 12. And the things that people talk about as deterrence, the biggest thing you hear about is the Sunday play. You guys have covered that, and I know you're going to cover it even more in depth on another show. But it literally has zero impact on the regular season. Zero. And they have some of the, what do I call them? Not smaller sports, but the Olympic sports that have had championships that they've played over a weekend's time. So they have to change a couple of those to accommodate BYU. But as far as football and basketball, the big visible sports are concerned, there's no changes needed whatsoever. And so it's a minuscule problem that they can solve. And what they get in return, you tell me, what's a bigger problem? Trying to overcome the Sunday play thing, which is in their control, or trying to figure out how to get these AAC schools out of their conference without huge financial penalties and big, huge lead-ins.
Yeah, and if you're not aware of what that is, there is a $10 million buyout once an AAC team were to say, okay, we're leaving for the Big 12, and then a 27-month waiting period after that. If they want to expedite that 27-month period, it's $1 million for every month early.
But and they can, you can fix that. If you're Cincinnati or you're whoever you are, since you say you're Houston, you come and say, that's fine. We know that the revenue share for the first year is $38 million in this new deal, and it's going to cost us $18 million to get out. So we'll just take an $18 million cut. The conference can just keep that. So you guys help us out. We'll take an $18 million cut. Well, I got news for you. The conference is going to ask these people to come in on a prorated basis anyhow over 2 or 3 years. And so,
or 4 has been kind of standard.
Which I think is fair. And I think that BYU will accept. And guys, we're going to have some big announcements here. BYU's going to be in the Big 12, and right after that, they're going to go out with that momentum. They're going to win the Pac-12 South. I mean, this is what a year! Come on, you guys, what a year!
And this is wild because I think, like you, I believe that BYU will be invited to the Big 12. And I don't know how soon, because yesterday we heard one thing Tuesday, and then yesterday with Bob Bowlesby, it was. I don't know that 2017 is realistic. And then just a little while ago, the governor of Texas said that Houston needs to be invited. That's his opinion.
Shout out to Greg Abbott.
So that kind of changes things. Now, remember the last time the governor of Texas got involved with BYU to potentially the Big 12? That didn't work out very well. Baylor got in. BYU did not get in. But this time it could be up to 4, so we'll see.
And they talk about television markets. Houston, obviously, one of the biggest television markets in the world.
Number 10 in the country.
But just because you're in that market doesn't mean that the eyeballs in that market are on you. And right now they're not.
You don't think UT and Texas A&M drive the Houston market?
Hey, Oklahoma has more fans in Houston than Houston has. And so it's not just about the market. It's about how much draw do you have in that market. And BYU has a draw in the Houston market, frankly. And in this market, even though it's not as big a television market, when BYU plays, the eyes of this market are unanimously on BYU. You go back, I remember looking at television ratings when Utah was playing in a Sugar Bowl and were really, really visible. BYU games would outdraw Utah games at that time. And Utah was on an unbelievable run, and they were really, really good. BYU just has a built-in fan base that no other school the Big 12 is looking at can bring with them.
Blaine Fowler with us on BYU Sports Nation discussing BYU's hopeful inclusion in the Big 12. He feels strongly that will happen. So does Jerem Jordan. Now, Jerem, you said yesterday my hope outweighs my expectation. Is that still the case, or are you starting to feel like the logic is weighing more heavily?
Big 12 and logic don't go in the same sense to me. Typically, like that hasn't been the case. Like I don't want to knock on the hopeful future conference, right? But we know that if logic was used, it would probably be a quick process. Now this is a possibility, right? That BYU has already been solidified as one of the candidates that will get in, and then they're figuring out other candidates. That's a possibility.
That's very likely. Here's what's funny: we were all hearing, we didn't go on air with it, a week and a half ago, that expansion was back on the table, that BYU was being considered, and there was going to be a big announcement.
But all the national guys were like, no!
And we were hearing this behind the scenes coming out of some people we know in Oklahoma, and we were hearing some of this. And everybody in the national media was going, "No, this thing is dead. They're not going to do expansion." Well, I think that the ACC's announcement about grant of rights and all of these things got Texas's attention, and all of a sudden now it became not only do we think we can pass this thing through? Now it's going to go through unanimously. Now everybody's on board, including Texas, and it goes through. So we're hearing behind the scenes that BYU is the obvious candidate. Anybody that's out there on a national basis that's listing teams and isn't putting BYU in the top 4 isn't doing their homework. Just go look. The conference hired an impartial, objective group to rate and rank all of these programs, and BYU's right at the top of that ranking of all the potential candidates. They didn't just say, hey, let's look at expansion. Yeah, you should expand. They looked at it and said, you should expand, and here's what this team combination does. Here's what this team combination does. Here's what this team individually brings in terms of value. You don't think that all of that objective data isn't going to point to BYU over and over and over again? And anybody that's saying that BYU's not a top 4 candidate, they're just not objectively looking at it.
Here's looking at you, Joe Schad of ESPN and Ralph Russo of the AP, who are opting for teams of like Colorado State.
Now I wonder if it's their opinion or who they're hearing, right? There's a difference.
So the other thing that you hear is a deterrent. So you hear this Sunday play thing, which I don't think is a big deal, and you guys have outlined that. You hear, and it's just not geographically close. Really? Do you care if you get on a plane and fly an extra half an hour or an extra hour? With the travel the way it is now, and the big revenue sports almost all charter now. So football and basketball teams charter. So they're just going to get on a plane. They're going to fly wherever into whatever airport. I'm telling you, there's some smaller towns that are already in the Big 12 that are harder to get to by plane because you have to get a connection if you're not chartering than it is to get to Salt Lake City, Utah, and Delta's Western United States hub. They have direct flights almost everywhere. And so it's not as big a deal as people think to be geographically separated from the rest of your conference. And wouldn't the Big 12 like to get into the Mountain Time Zone so you can schedule a BYU game that goes a little bit later? I would think the TV partners will go, oh, good.
You'd be in 3 time zones.
We can schedule a little bit later game and have a doubleheader now in the Big 12 if BYU's got a home game out there. So there are things that people talk about as deterrents that I don't think are as big a deterrent as some of those folks think.
Bob Bowlesby, the Big 12 commissioner, said this morning, and we already talked about this, quote, geographic footprint is not as important as it was 25 years ago. He said that to Mike and Mike on ESPN. It's a 2-hour and 10-minute flight, 2-hour and 15-minute flight into the Dallas-Austin area for BYU. The one area that would get a little bit tricky would be for the non-revenue generating sports, smaller sports, BYU having to travel to Morgantown, West Virginia.
Or Cincinnati.
But guess what? They still make those trips in preseason.
Do you want to know what? You know this with my other work, and with my broadcasting work outside of BYU. I'm coming up on 2 million miles with Delta, right?
Oh, my goodness.
It's easier for me to get to Cincinnati than it is for me to get to Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and it costs less for me to fly to Cincinnati than it does to go to Boise.
Really?
Yeah, because you're talking hub.
Flights are available.
You're talking hub to hub.
Yeah.
You're talking Salt Lake City to Cincinnati is a direct flight to the tune of multiple flights a day back and forth. Now Morgantown's a little tougher to get to, but it just is, period. But there are major airports that Salt Lake City has direct flights from that are in that metropolitan, in that area back there. So they have one connecting flight, but they have a connecting flight to anywhere they're going in the conference. Yeah. So it's the cost is I go back and forth to the East Coast all the time. I go back when I covered the A-10, I flew out every Friday night back to the East Coast. It's not that big of a deal. Get on the flight, you get off 3.5 hours later, and you're there. So the whole travel thing and geographic proximity, the world's a smaller place, and it's not as big a deal as people think.
Blaine, fantastic stuff, man. Always bringing the heat.
We're going to win a Pac-12 South Championship. We're getting into the Big 12. that is what today is all about.
Both of those will happen by the middle of September?
We'll know in football season. We'll know all of this. And then BYU's football program will ride the wave of that.
This all sounds great. It really does.
Yeah. Jerem's on board. Woo!
I am on board.
Let's go, man.
With these guys.
But and BYU's going to play a lot better than you two played golf yesterday. That's all I have to say.
Okay.
All right. Anyway, see ya.
Okay.